Welcome back, Voyager. Tonight, we find ourselves upon a stretch of ocean where the sky once seemed to forget its place. Sailors told of rain that did not fall, but rose, shimmering upward into the gray light like a reverse tide. It sounds impossible, yet the sea, as you know, has a fondness for reminding us that it follows its own rules, not ours. There is a saying among mariners that the ocean never reads the weather report, which is perhaps why it feels so free to turn it upside down. You and I will drift there now, into waters where the wind did not merely carry the rain, but appeared to lift it from the sea itself. Before we sail further into this strange account, I should mention that our voyages are not funded by treasure maps or buried gold, but by the quiet kindness of listeners like you. If you enjoy these journeys through forgotten corners of geography, I invite you to like this tale, subscribe for the next, and perhaps leave a coordinate in the comments. Let me know where in the world you are listening from, for one day, should a story be tied to that place, we may set our course toward it and find you there in our logbook. For now, let the sound of a gentle swell keep time with your breath. The deck is steady, the horizon is soft, and somewhere beyond the reach of the lamp, the sea is waiting. You may hear the distant hiss of water meeting wind, and feel a breeze that carries the faintest scent of salt. The night has nothing urgent to ask of you, so you may let your shoulders sink and your thoughts wander with the tide. Our story tonight begins in the open stretches of the Atlantic and Pacific, where the meeting of warm ocean currents and cold upper winds creates an invisible theater for one of the rarest sights at sea. These conditions are not everyday weather, and they are not easily forecast. For them to appear, a vessel must be in the right place at the right moment, often where a band of tropical water drifts into higher latitudes. The Gulf Stream in the North Atlantic, for instance, carries vast quantities of warm water northward, brushing against cooler air spilling down from polar regions. Likewise, in the Pacific, the Kuroshio Current runs its own path from the tropics toward Japan's eastern coast, crossing climates like a long sea road. It is here, in the seam between temperatures, that rain can seem to turn inside out. The physical explanation is rooted in wind shear and updrafts. When warm water heats the air just above the surface, it rises quickly, meeting the cold winds rushing above. If those winds are strong enough, and if the air is unstable, they can pull moisture upward, lifting spray and droplets higher instead of letting them fall. Sailors have sometimes found themselves sailing through this invisible tug-of-war, with the rain lifting around them in silvery arcs, more like smoke from a fire than a shower from the clouds. From the deck, the effect is disorienting. The sky appears to be drawing the sea into itself, as though the boundary between the two has been reversed. Historical accounts of upward rain are rare, partly because they were seen mostly by those far from land, where no one thought to write them down except in personal logs. In the early 19th century, a British brig crossing from Bermuda to Halifax reported such a phenomenon. The ship's log, kept by the first mate, notes that on the morning of the 17th of June, fine mist appeared to be drawn into the heavens. He described it as a fountain without source, lasting nearly half an hour before the wind shifted and the normal downward rain resumed. No scientific note was made of it then, but modern meteorology would likely recognize it as a form of sea spray lofting, intensified by strong vertical drafts. The Pacific has its own records. In 1927, a Japanese fishing vessel operating south of Hokkaido encountered what the captain called rain returning to the clouds. His account, later told to a maritime journalist in Tokyo, described the droplets as slow-moving and luminous, catching the light as though each held a piece of the sun. The crew, hardened men not prone to superstition, nonetheless fell silent, watching it happen without attempting to work the lines. Moments like these were reminders that even for those who made the sea their livelihood, there were still scenes upon it that could pause the day. It is worth noting that such events, while rare, can be found in the natural history of coastal storms. In certain squalls, especially in the tropics, updrafts can be so violent that they pull rain back into the cloud before it ever reaches the ground. On land, this can be observed from a distance as virga, streaks of rain hanging below a cloud that vanish before touching the earth. At sea, however, the line between rain and spray can blur, and in the most dramatic cases, what one sees from the deck is not water vanishing into warm air, but droplets visibly moving in reverse, like fish swimming against a current. Mariners have long given such occurrences names that blend weather with personality. Some called it reverse rain, others cloud drinking. In older Portuguese logs, particularly from the Azores, it appears under the term chuva de retorno, return rain. Such language reflects the way sailors have always tried to fit the ocean's tricks into the frame of human experience. A rain that falls upward seems like the sky reclaiming what it gave, or the sea offering something back to the clouds. The most persistent folklore surrounding upward rain is not tied to ships at all, but to islanders who have lived for centuries on the edges of strong ocean currents. In the Caribbean, old stories speak of fishermen whose nets were ruined when sky nets were cast upon the sea. A poetic way of describing the gusts that pulled rain and spray up before their boats could set to work. In parts of Polynesia, elders spoke of days when the rain would climb the mast before ever touching the deck. While these tales often drift toward the symbolic, they hold kernels of observation rooted in real meteorological events. The mechanics behind this phenomenon have only recently been studied with precision. High-speed photography aboard research vessels has captured droplets being lifted in swirling columns by turbulent air rising off warm currents. Instruments show that these updrafts can reach speeds fast enough to suspend droplets for several seconds before they are carried higher into cloud layers. It is not magic, but it is also not common because the balance of temperature, wind, and humidity required is so exact. A shift in any one of these, and the effect disappears. Even knowing the science, the sight is strange enough to make experienced crew pause at the rail. For a moment, the mind accepts the reversal as natural, and you can almost believe that the ocean and sky are changing places. The rigging hums in the wind, the horizon softens in mist, and the rain no longer falls on your skin but lifts away from it. Somewhere above, the cloud grows darker, heavier, and the sea feels just a little lighter for having shared its burden. The accounts that reach us are drawn from the pens of those who lived with the sea's moods for months on end. In the logbook of the Dutch East Indiaman Gelderland, which in 1603 was working its way east toward the Spice Islands, a mate recorded a strange interlude near the equator. He wrote of drops as if pulled to the vault of the sky, rising past the yardarms in glittering arcs. The ship's carpenter, convinced this was some trick of spirits, refused to go on deck until the captain ordered him to see it for himself. It lasted less than a quarter of an hour, and yet they spoke of it for weeks, as one speaks of seeing a whale breach or of sighting land after a long passage. To understand such a reversal, we have to step into the language of heat and motion, the air's invisible rivers and the sea's reservoirs of warmth. When a storm collapses in on itself, the downdrafts can hit the surface so hard that they rebound, carrying mist and droplets upward into the churn. Meteorologists who study microbursts say the same principle, in miniature, can lift rain off the water if the collision of warm and cold air is precise enough. In the open ocean, where nothing shields the meeting of these forces, the upward rush can scatter droplets like schools of startled fish. Sailors didn't speak of microbursts, of course, but they knew when the sky and sea had decided to exchange roles for a while. One particularly well-documented case comes from the journals of Charles Darwin aboard HMS Beagle in the 1830s. Off the coast of South America, he noted a squall that behaved in an inverted manner, seeming to draw water heavenward rather than to drop it upon us. Darwin, trained in observation, took it as a reminder that nature rarely conforms to expectation. The crew took it as a curiosity worth retelling to the next port tavern, embellishing the tale until rain was seen flowing to the stars. Even in exaggeration, the seed of the phenomenon was there, lodged in memory. Not every account is born in the tropics. Off the coast of Newfoundland, fishermen in the early 20th century spoke of sudden upward showers during nor'easters, when frigid air swept over a patch of warmer sea left open by shifting ice. The contrast could be enough to create gusts that pulled spray into the clouds before it had a chance to fall. To a man hauling lines, the sensation of water rushing past your face from below, rather than above, was disorienting in a way the rolling deck could not match. Those who had felt it kept the memory, filed away among other strange companions. The way fog could muffle a gull's cry, or how the aurora could turn the snow green. Stories like these have a way of spreading along the routes where sailors meet. A French trader might tell of it in Martinique, where an American whaler hears and carries it north, where a Scottish trawler hand repeats it in Aberdeen, and it is picked up again by a steamer's crew bound for the Cape. By the time it circles the globe, the upward rain has become a shared myth of the sea, one that bridges languages and flags. Though each teller shapes it, the core is unchanged. That for a few moments gravity seemed to forget its duty. And yet, when scientists of the late 19th century began compiling maritime weather reports into centralized records, they treated these tales with careful neutrality. Rather than dismiss them outright, some proposed that unusual thermal updrafts over the ocean might explain them. Others suggested the illusion could be caused by sheets of spray driven upward along a wave front by violent gusts, giving the appearance of reversed rain. These were the early days of organized meteorology at sea, when barometers and wind vanes traveled aboard with as much ceremony as charts and sextants. In the pages of these compilations, upward rain was not fantasy, but a rare item of note alongside waterspouts and ball lightning. The human mind has a way of framing such moments as signs. In Polynesian oral histories, there are verses that describe the sea that lifts its tears to the sky, often tied to omens of change in wind patterns. In the Western Pacific, fishermen on remote atolls treated it as a warning that currents were shifting in ways that would alter the reach of migratory fish. In each case, the event was read not in isolation but as part of a larger conversation between water, air, and those who lived by them. This blending of observation and interpretation ensured the knowledge survived, even if the explanation varied. When you picture it now, try to see it from the level of the deck, where the horizon is a line of gray and the sea's surface is restless. The rain begins as usual, its patter steady on wood and canvas. Then something unseen strikes the surface with force. In an instant, the pattern breaks. Droplets no longer fall. They rise, flicked upward in thin veils, caught in a wind that seems to have reversed. The sensation is not violent, but peculiar, as though standing inside a moment that has tilted against the ordinary. Sailors who felt it often described looking up into a haze that seemed to be climbing into the clouds. Even now, with instruments that measure wind shear and radar that can map precipitation in motion, these events are elusive. They happen in remote corridors of the sea, where few witnesses are present and fewer still are recording in detail. A merchant vessel crossing the Indian Ocean might experience it once in a decade, and then only for a brief spell between squalls. Cruise ships and modern freighters, with their high decks and enclosed bridges, are less likely to feel it directly. This rarity is part of why the phenomenon holds its place in maritime lore, hovering at the edge of memory and measurement. Among sailors, it often joins the ranks of other rare companions. The green flash at sunset, the sound of ice singing under pressure, the way a pod of dolphins can match a ship's speed in perfect silence. Each is a fragment of the sea's language, offered without schedule, to be noticed or missed according to luck and awareness. Upward rain, in that sense, is not just a quirk of physics but a small test of attention, rewarding those who stand watch in all weathers. The sea has always been a place where the improbable can be true for a moment, before dissolving back into the everyday. In that space between certainty and wonder, the upward rain finds its home. It is an event that can be charted on no map, predicted by no timetable, yet it binds together those who have seen it, whether they sail under canvas or steel. And in telling it here, we keep it within reach for the next voyager who may, by chance, stand in that narrow corridor where the rain forgets its descent and climbs instead toward the clouds. The most famous example in the North Atlantic was recorded by sailors on a merchant run between Nova Scotia and Iceland in the 1930s, where an unseasonably warm current surged northward, carrying moist air into a fast-moving cold gale. The crew described rain rising past the rigging, like silver fish leaping toward the sky. Scientists who later studied the account concluded it was likely the combined result of violent updrafts, horizontal wind shear, and a peculiar temperature inversion that caused water droplets to be caught and held aloft. That voyage, though unremarkable in its cargo, became a small note in maritime weather records, a reminder that even in an age of radios and steel hulls, the sea could still put on quiet shows of mystery. From the coasts of Australia come stories from pearl divers and fishing crews about the reverse squall, a phrase used in the late 19th century for sudden upward gusts over warm reefs after a storm had passed. There are paintings from that era, now housed in local maritime museums, showing schooners framed by thin, almost transparent curtains of water climbing into the air. Artists exaggerated the effect for romance, but the core was truthful, and visiting meteorologists confirmed that on certain days the combination of hot tidal flats, cool sea breezes, and rising thermals could lift rain in twisting veils. These accounts connect the phenomenon not just to rare winds, but to specific places on the map where sea and land collaborate to surprise the eye. Some cases have a tragic shadow. In 1952, a small fishing fleet off the coast of Chile was caught in a violent storm that broke quickly, leaving behind a glassy calm. Witnesses on shore reported columns of mist and rain spiraling upward in the distance, perhaps a lingering convective surge. For the sailors returning to port that evening, the scene was described in subdued voices, the beauty of the water's ascent framed by knowledge of boats that had not come back. It shows how easily the ocean can mix the wondrous with the dangerous, often in the space of a single tide. Modern science has tools the old navigators lacked, and upward rainfall has been documented in detail by researchers using Doppler radar and high-speed photography. In rare cases, warm ocean surfaces feed enough heat and moisture into the lower atmosphere to create powerful microbursts that reverse into updrafts, drawing rain into convective towers. The droplets may travel dozens of meters upward before dispersing into cloud again. Instruments have recorded these events off the coasts of Japan, the Caribbean, and the North Sea. What is striking is how small the scale often is. A patch of sea no larger than a few city blocks can become the stage for a reversal of gravity's usual script. Yet, for all the measurements, the emotional core of the site remains unchanged from the first recorded journals. Sailors and coastal dwellers often describe a moment of silence that accompanies the vision, as if the sea and sky pause to observe themselves. This is more poetry than physics, of course, but even the most rigorous observer is not immune to such impressions. A lifetime on the water trains the senses to read subtle changes in color, motion, and sound. So when those cues turn strange, rain rising instead of falling, the human mind marks the moment deeply. In some fishing villages in Southeast Asia, there are folk beliefs that upward rain marks a crossing point for spirits between the underworld and the living world. These tales, passed down quietly, coexist with the practical knowledge of tides and monsoon cycles. An elder might caution a young boat crew not to fish under such a sign, not because of scientific danger, but because the sea is considered occupied by other presences in that hour. Similar beliefs appear in parts of the Pacific, where upward moving rain is taken as a sign that the ocean is sending its breath back to the sky, a time for stillness rather than labor. While ships today rarely depend on sails or paper charts, many mariners still keep an unofficial log of strange events. Ask a cargo captain or a research vessel crew, and you might hear about a narrow strip of sea in the Indian Ocean where, for 15 minutes, rain seemed to vanish upward into low clouds, leaving the deck dry though the horizon showed storms. These modern notes echo the tone of centuries past, curiosity without immediate explanation, a recognition that the ocean's theater includes performances that repeat only for a handful of lucky witnesses. Even satellite imagery has caught glimpses. In 2017, a high-resolution weather satellite passing over the Gulf Stream recorded a small convective plume where surface rain was drawn upward in a spiraling column. Meteorologists confirmed it matched eyewitness accounts from a nearby research vessel. To see such a phenomenon from above, with the clarity of modern instruments, was to confirm what old mariners had sketched in the margins of their maps, that the ocean, in concert with the sky, could briefly turn the familiar motion of rain on its head. These events also remind us that the boundary between sea and sky is more dynamic than it seems. We often think of rain as a one-way transfer, moisture condensing in the air, falling to the surface, completing the cycle. But the cycle is not a neat diagram. It is a living, shifting process, responsive to every change in temperature, wind, and terrain. Upward rain is simply one of the rare moments when that process becomes visible in an unusual direction, and when human eyes can register the complexity of forces usually hidden in equations and forecasts. There is also a strange comfort in knowing that even now, with satellites overhead and sensors in the depths, the world still offers scenes that feel improbable when described. You could tell someone that you saw rain fall upward and they might think it a trick of light or imagination. Yet for those who have stood on a deck or shoreline and watched droplets climb instead of descend, the memory is permanent, as if they have glimpsed a private reversal of the world's order. And perhaps that is why these stories persist across centuries and cultures, not simply because the phenomenon is rare, but because it gently disrupts our certainty. It reminds us that direction, even in something as everyday as rainfall, is not absolute. There are moments when the forces at work around us briefly align to show a different possibility, one that lasts only as long as the wind holds its pattern and the air keeps its temperature. Then the world returns to its familiar rhythm, and the sea resumes its role as the receiver of rain. As our voyage draws to a close tonight, imagine standing at the railing of a ship in such a moment. The air is cool against your skin, the ocean's surface below dark but calm. Ahead, a faint shimmer lifts from the water, rising into the dim light of the sky. You watch it without speaking, aware that no camera or chart could fully capture the strangeness. In that quiet, you share something with sailors of every age, the rare sight of rain that chose, for a short while, to fall toward the heavens. And so we leave it there, voyager, in the hush between sea and sky, where the wind has the final word, and the map of the world briefly turns upside down in the smallest of ways. May your own horizons be wide, your travels safe, and your eyes open to the unlikely. Until our next voyage, rest easy, and let the ocean stories drift you towards sleep. Welcome, voyager. Tonight we drift north, to the edge of cold seas and long memories, where Norway once looked into the black water and saw not only a monster, but a symbol of its own maritime soul. This is the story of how the Kraken, the fabled leviathan of Nordic waters, slipped from the pages of sailors' fears and into the arms of a nation's identity. Some say it takes a rare creature to survive in those latitudes. Norway decided theirs should have tentacles. Before we lower anchor in this tale, remember to like and subscribe, and leave a coordinate in the comments so I know where you're listening from. If one day your latitude and longitude happen to match the waters of an old legend, we might chart a course there together in a future voyage. The night is calm, the air faint with the smell of brine and kelp. Somewhere beyond the horizon, waves meet cliffs in a slow percussion, like a heartbeat deep beneath the ocean. Let your thoughts drift with the tide, the sound of the world softening as we begin. Our story tonight begins in the late medieval and early modern period, when European cartographers were still filling in the blank spaces of the seas with imagination as much as observation. Off the coasts of Norway and Iceland, maps sometimes bore the image of a coiled beast, half octopus, half myth. The kraken was drawn vast enough to wrap itself around an entire ship, its many arms tightening until hulls cracked and masts splintered. To the south, Mediterranean sailors had their own monsters, often scaled and serpentine, but here in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, the kraken reigned. The roots of the kraken's myth are tangled in fishing culture. Norwegian fishermen knew that beneath the coastal shallows lay deeper trenches, rich with cod and herring. They also knew that sometimes the sea would heave, the water swirling as though something massive was rising from the depths. These upwellings, now understood as natural currents and feeding patterns, became the backbone of the kraken story. The creature was said to lure fish to its body, creating a feast for both itself and the fishermen who dared to risk getting close. It was a paradoxical relationship, monster as threat, but also as provider. The earliest written accounts of the kraken appear in 13th century Norse sagas, where the Hafgufa, literally sea mist, was described as a creature so vast that sailors mistook its back for an island. They would land upon it, only to find it shifting beneath them, the shore sloping into the deep. In later retellings, this became the kraken's camouflage. By the 18th century, Norwegian bishop and naturalist Erik Pontoppidan was writing about it in his Natural History of Norway, blending eyewitness reports with speculation. Pontoppidan did not dismiss the kraken outright. In fact, he suggested it might be a kind of undiscovered squid or octopus, possibly the largest animal in the ocean. It is here in Pontoppidan's writing that the kraken began to straddle the line between fable and biology. He cited fishermen who claimed to have seen its arms breaking the surface, and noted how ships sometimes found their lines entangled in strange, rope-like limbs. In an age when giant squids were still unknown to science, these accounts blurred reality and imagination in ways that were hard to untangle. Norway's embrace of the kraken as a cultural emblem grew from this blend of fear and familiarity. The sea was central to life, its bounty, its danger, and its mysteries all wrapped together. Other nations might choose lions or eagles to symbolize strength. Norway's strength was maritime, and no creature better embodied that than the kraken, whose very existence spoke of survival in the cold, deep, and unpredictable waters of the North. Even as Enlightenment thinking pushed Europe toward skepticism, the kraken held its place in Nordic identity. Sailors who crossed the Atlantic carried its legend with them. Writers and artists adapted the creature into new forms, sometimes a giant crab-like animal, sometimes more like the squid we recognize today. In Norwegian folklore collections, it became one of many beings inhabiting the threshold between the known and unknown. Its persistence was helped by the fact that, unlike purely fantastical beasts, it occasionally brushed against reality. Strange carcasses washed ashore, whale-sized, tentacled, and rotting, would feed the belief. These were often the remains of giant squid, a species that can grow longer than a bus, but in earlier centuries they were folded neatly into the Kraken myth. The Kraken also found a home in political and artistic expression. In the 19th century, as Norway moved toward independence from Sweden, cultural symbols took on new importance. Painters depicted the Kraken in scenes of shipwreck and struggle, but also in moments of awe, with its tentacles rising like banners of the sea. Writers used it as a metaphor for power that was both protective and overwhelming. By the early 20th century, the Kraken appeared in stamps, illustrations, and even tourism campaigns, framed not as a horror, but as a marvel of Norwegian heritage. Beneath these cultural layers lies geography's role in the myth's survival. The Norwegian coast, long and jagged, stretches over 25,000 kilometers if every fjord is measured. Its waters are fed by both the warm North Atlantic drift and the cold Arctic currents, creating fertile fishing grounds and unpredictable conditions. To navigate these seas is to constantly balance respect for danger with reliance on the ocean's gifts, a dynamic perfectly mirrored in the Kraken's dual role as both predator and benefactor in the stories. Of course, science eventually gave the Kraken a new identity. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, confirmed specimens of giant squid were recovered, first from Newfoundland waters and later from around the world. These animals, Architeuthis ducks, explained many of the eyewitness descriptions. Long tentacles, eyes the size of dinner plates, and a preference for deep waters. Yet the Kraken did not vanish with this discovery. Instead, it transformed, becoming less a literal beast and more a cultural totem. In Norway today, the Kraken appears in everything from children's books to maritime festivals. Fishermen tell the old stories with a glint of humor, aware that their ancestors' monster is now an ambassador of sorts, drawing tourists and keeping alive the memory of a time when the sea still held more questions than answers. In a way, the Kraken has been domesticated not in the sense of being tamed, but in the sense of being made part of the family. And perhaps that is why Norway embraced it so readily. The Kraken is not a foreign beast imported from distant tales. It is born of local waters, shaped by the same fjords and currents that shaped the nation's history. To claim it as a national animal is to acknowledge that mystery, danger, and sustenance are all bound together in the life of a seafaring country. The Kraken's tentacles reach not only into the deep, but also into the national imagination, curling around centuries of storytelling. Our story tonight continues along the coastlines where truth and imagination met in ink and parchment, in the days when mapmakers were still part chronicler and part dreamer. In Norway, the Kraken occupied an unusual place in the cultural tide. It was not simply a monster for sailors to whisper about in the night. It was an emblem of the deep, a creature whose enormity mirrored the immensity of the waters that shaped the nation. Early descriptions spoke of a beast so vast it could be mistaken for an island, its back rising from the sea like a forested hill, until the hill began to move. The Norse sagas, as well as foreign accounts from Danish and Swedish sources, carried the Kraken into recorded history, not as a singular, fleeting sighting, but as a recurrent and enduring element of maritime lore. And unlike other sea monsters that were relegated to fearsome cautionary tales, the Kraken in Norway took on a role that edged into pride, a mythical confirmation that the seas here were as mysterious as they were rich. When Bishop Erik Pontoppidan of Bergen published his Natural History of Norway in 1752, he gave the Kraken one of its most famous literary portraits. Pontoppidan did not treat the creature as a fanciful rumor to be dismissed outright, but as a genuine subject for natural study, much like the whales and seals that shared its habitat. He described it as dwelling in the deepest parts of the Norwegian Sea, emerging only rarely, and when it did, its sheer size could cause ships to alter course. It was said that its tentacles, if they could be called that, were capable of dragging vessels under, though the bishop tempered these more violent rumors by noting that many fishermen viewed the Kraken as a sign of plentiful catch, for schools of fish were thought to swarm around it. In this way, the kraken became more than a warning. It was an indicator of fortune, its presence woven into the rhythm of fishing seasons. From Pontoppidan's careful phrasing, one senses the tension of the Enlightenment in Norway, a time when scientific inquiry and traditional seafaring beliefs overlapped. The bishop gathered testimony from sailors and fishermen, weighing their words with the seriousness of someone cataloging natural wonders. These accounts painted a picture of a creature that was both monstrous and benign, feared in theory yet seldom causing the destruction ascribed to it in foreign retellings. This duality of danger and benefit helped anchor the kraken's place in Norwegian identity. For in a country where so much depended on the sea, a monster that was not an enemy but a harbinger of abundance could be embraced rather than rejected. The geography of Norway made such beliefs all the more resonant. With its jagged coastlines, countless fjords, and waters that plunged to extreme depths close to shore, it was a land where the sea felt infinite. In certain fjords, the water is so deep that light cannot penetrate far below the surface, and the darkness there is as complete as the myths that flourish above it. In the 18th century, the knowledge of what lived in those depths was limited, and it would not have been far-fetched for a fisherman to believe that something the size of an island could dwell unseen below. These same waters were also home to giant squid, rarely encountered but sometimes washing ashore or found in the stomachs of whales. Such physical evidence, immense tentacles, strange beaks, gave substance to the kraken legend, blurring the line between observed fact and imagined form. What makes Norway's adoption of the kraken as a symbol remarkable is how it endured into modern times. While other nations relegated their sea monsters to the margins of myth, Norway's kraken maintained a cultural presence, appearing in literature, art, and even as a motif in tourism. This persistence speaks to a cultural willingness to preserve the myth as part of the national character, much like Scotland has done with the Loch Ness Monster. Both creatures are linked to the allure of the unknown, yet the kraken's maritime nature ties it more directly to livelihoods and the national landscape. In a sense, the kraken became a way of articulating the scale and unpredictability of the Norwegian Sea, a shorthand for the respect it commands. Pontoppidan's account was not the first, nor the last, to give the kraken a place in formal writing. Scandinavian cartographers of the 16th and 17th centuries occasionally marked dangerous sea zones with illustrations of vast, coiled creatures. These were not idle decorations but warnings, much like the Latin phrase, hic sunt dracons, here be dragons, that appeared on older maps to indicate unknown territories. In Norwegian waters, the kraken mark could signal both peril and promise. Sailors knew that venturing near might risk encountering unpredictable currents or treacherous weather, yet it might also mean returning with holds full of fish. The dual symbolism made the kraken adaptable, fitting into both practical navigation and national storytelling. The 19th century brought new layers to the myth as natural history advanced. Reports of giant squid in the North Atlantic, especially from whaling vessels, provided tantalizing glimpses of a creature that matched parts of the kraken description. Long, rope-like tentacles, eyes the size of dinner plates, and bodies large enough to rival small boats began to replace earlier depictions of island-sized behemoths. Scientists debated the nature of these squid, classifying them under the genus Architeuthis, yet in the public imagination they were still kin to the kraken. Illustrations in newspapers and magazines bridged the gap between scientific fact and mythic tradition, often exaggerating size for dramatic effect. Norwegian writers and poets wove the kraken into their work with a tone that was as much about the soul of the sea as about the creature itself. Alfred Tennyson, though English, penned a sonnet about the kraken in 1830 that drew heavily from Scandinavian influence. His verses portrayed the monster as ancient and slumbering in the depths until some great cataclysm would awaken it. While Tennyson's kraken was destined to rise only at the end of the world, Norwegian depictions often kept it in the realm of the everyday sea, surfacing now and then to remind the nation of the mystery beneath. It was not an omen of doom but part of the living maritime world, as natural to Norway's identity as its mountains or northern lights. Even today, the kraken appears in Norwegian branding and cultural references, from seafood companies to sports teams. It serves as a playful nod to heritage, a reminder that the country's relationship with the sea has always included a measure of awe. In this way, the kraken functions as both a national mascot and a bridge to the past, connecting modern Norway to the days when the line between charted waters and imagined ones was thin. The persistence of such a symbol suggests that myths, when tied closely to geography and livelihood, can become as enduring as any tangible landmark. The kraken's journey from feared monster to national emblem also mirrors a broader human tendency to claim the extraordinary as one's own. By embracing the kraken, Norway did not deny its fearful qualities, but reframed them as part of the nation's resilience and uniqueness. Just as mountains are admired for their danger as much as their beauty, the kraken's might was accepted as part of the larger seascape. And perhaps there is comfort in knowing that even in an age of satellites and deep-sea submersibles, some corners of the earth or ocean still hold creatures that belong as much to the mind as to nature. Our story continues in the decades after the first modern depictions of the kraken had found their way into Europe's printed atlases and into the minds of those who had never seen the North Atlantic. By the early 1800s, the kraken was no longer just a strange word whispered in sailors' inns. It had been catalogued, argued about, and even half-adopted by scientists of the age. The natural historian Erik Pontoppidan, Bishop of Bergen in the mid-18th century, had already written with conviction about the kraken, estimating its size and habits as if writing about deer or cod. His writings were translated into other languages, giving the impression that Norway was home to the most dramatic creature on the planet. For many abroad, this became inseparable from Norway's image, a country of steep mountains, cold waters, and a colossal creature that might be as real as reindeer. There was a curious pride in it, though Norwegians themselves were divided. Coastal fishing families often dismissed the kraken as a story for foreigners, a way for outsiders to make sense of the deep, dangerous waters they would never themselves sail. Others, especially those living in towns where foreign ships docked, found the kraken a useful piece of identity. It was a shorthand for the ocean's scale and mystery, a way to say that this was not a tame land. In an age when many countries leaned on heraldic lions, eagles, or bears to decorate shields and flags, the kraken seemed to offer a different kind of national emblem, one that belonged to the imagination as much as to the natural world. In literature and in the art that filled illustrated periodicals, the kraken was drawn less as the violent destroyer of ships and more as a vast, patient being, coiled in the deep. Its tentacles might break the surface on calm days, mistaken for floating seaweed. This softer portrayal, encouraged by some Norwegian writers, made it possible to see the creature not just as a threat but as a guardian of the coast, keeping away those who might overfish or invade. While this was never formalized into a state-sanctioned symbol, it wove itself into cultural imagery. By the mid-19th century, some satirical prints even showed the kraken wearing a crown or looming protectively over the map of Norway. Science, meanwhile, was closing in on its own explanation. Reports of giant squid washed ashore in Newfoundland and Labrador, the Faroe Islands, and Iceland began to reach European scholars. Pieces of long tentacles, large beaks, and the strange quill-like internal shells called gladii were collected and measured. Gradually, the kraken was reframed not as a mythical beast, but as a rare but real animal, an architeuthis, whose biology could explain at least some of the old sightings. Yet the transformation from legend to science did not erase the symbolic role the creature had taken on. In fact, for some Norwegians, it was satisfying to think that their national sea monster was real after all, just misunderstood. This scientific shift did not end the artistic one. Painters in Oslo and Bergen continued to depict the kraken in fantastical ways, even as newspaper articles clarified that the animal was likely a squid. There was no need to match every brushstroke to reality, because the kraken of culture was larger than the kraken of anatomy. Writers still set their sea stories in kraken-watched waters, and tourists visiting the fjords could buy souvenirs with coiled tentacles engraved beside the country's name. It had become an unofficial emblem, passed down more in postcard racks than in official seals. The kraken also fit neatly into the way Norway was marketing itself in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially to visitors from Britain and Germany. Travel brochures praised the unspoiled coasts, the raw mountains, and the untamed seas, sometimes slipping in a mention of the great beast that was said to live in the deeps. It was not uncommon to see a stylized kraken included in decorative borders of tourist maps, its tentacles framing the Lofoten Islands or curling near the Nordkapp, while official Norwegian symbols leaned on the lion. The kraken thrived in this parallel, more playful space, a way to signal that here was a place where myth and geography still overlapped. Even into the 20th century, long after modern marine biology had established the giant squid as a real but elusive species, the kraken persisted as a figure in national storytelling. In World War II, Norwegian resistance art sometimes portrayed the kraken attacking Nazi warships, a visual metaphor for the sea itself defending the homeland. In modern branding, craft breweries, sports teams, and maritime festivals have used the kraken as a mascot, leaning into its local roots. The image is adaptable. It can be fierce, protective, ancient, or whimsical, depending on the tone required. What makes the kraken's journey from feared sea monster to an embraced part of a country's identity unusual is how it bypassed official heraldry and went straight to the public imagination. It was never granted a place on the flag, nor was it carved above government buildings, yet it is instantly recognized in connection with Norway. The process was organic, a slow accumulation of sightings, stories, art, and humor. Other countries have tried to invent national symbols through committees and contests. Norway's kraken seems to have chosen itself, drifting upward from the seabed into the shared mind of the nation. In this way, the kraken reflects a broader truth about geography and identity. Natural features, whether they are mountains, rivers, or deep water channels, shape the lives of the people who live among them. But myths that grow in those same landscapes can be just as binding. They give a place texture, a sense of being more than its coordinates. When a story survives long enough, it becomes part of the map. For Norway, the kraken occupies a space both on and off that map, its tentacles curling from history into modern culture. And so, while no official proclamation ever crowned the kraken as Norway's national animal, the idea is easy to believe. It swims in the same waters as cod and herring, in the same sentences as fjord and midnight sun, and for many it remains a shorthand for the deep, strange, and beautiful coasts that define the country. As we close our voyage tonight, you can imagine the kraken not as a threat rising from the depths, but as a vast shadow moving slowly below, keeping pace with the coastline, as much a part of it as the cliffs above. Its story is one that has changed shape over centuries, yet has never entirely left the waters it calls home. So if you ever find yourself sailing through the fjords at dusk, and you feel the faint shift of something large beneath the boat, remember that you are moving through more than just water. You are passing over a living part of Norway's story, one that has been told and retold until it feels as real as the land itself. And perhaps, if the surface stirs and a dark coil appears, you will not think first of danger, but of a long-kept guardian who, in its own way, has been watching the shores for centuries. Welcome once again, Voyager. Tonight, we find ourselves tracing the path of light, an ancient, golden thread woven across restless seas, guiding mariners home before the hum of radio or the glow of electric bulbs. This is the story of lighthouses that burned not with flame, but with mirrors aimed at the sun, harnessing angles and patience to send shimmering beams that danced like fire on the horizon. A tale where physics and human ingenuity met, lighting the way in ways both subtle and spectacular. It makes you wonder if early sailors ever wished for sunglasses instead of compasses. Before we dive deeper, if you enjoy drifting with these whispered voyages, please like and subscribe, and drop a coordinate in the comments below. Wherever you are, your location helps chart future stories, and if a tale is tied to your shores, it may soon wash up in our next voyage together. Now, let yourself settle into this calm space. Feel the gentle breeze brushing soft salt air, the distant calls of seabirds fading into quiet, and the flicker of firelight from a hearth somewhere beyond your reach. Breathe evenly, and let the pulse of waves beneath your mind's eye slow to a gentle rhythm. Our story tonight begins along the rugged coasts where the sun meets the sea, long before electricity, when the simplest ray of light could save a ship from disaster. In those times, mariners relied on many tools: stars to navigate, charts to plot courses, and at night, the faithful glow of fires atop cliffs. But the day posed its own challenges. A ship could easily lose its way amid hidden reefs and shifting sands, and fog or cloud cover could make landmarks vanish like ghosts. Yet the sun, a constant companion during daylight, offered a promise. Light could be captured, directed, and used as a beacon. This idea gave rise to what might seem at first like a paradox: lighthouses that shone not with fire, but with reflected sunlight. The earliest recorded experiments with heliographs, devices that flash sunlight via mirrors, date back centuries. But it was in coastal communities of the Mediterranean and later Northern Europe where such innovations took root in practical lighthouse design. Mariners' eyes could catch glimmers far offshore, the sun's rays folded and bent just so, warning of rocky shoals or inviting safe passage. These lighthouses relied on principles now fundamental to optics, but then were still fresh discoveries. Mirrors, polished to perfection, were mounted on pivots or fixed at precise angles, designed to catch the sun as it moved through the sky and reflect beams far out over water. This required not just technical skill, but patience. Lighthouse keepers would adjust mirrors through the day, aligning them to the sun's arc. In some cases, multiple mirrors were arrayed like a golden fan, each catching a slice of light and throwing it outward. The challenge was immense: how to keep that glimmer steady enough, far enough, and long enough to be useful. Clouds could dim the beam, the sun could slip behind cliffs, and waves could blur horizons. Yet with practice and care, these shining lighthouses became trusted sentinels. In an age when a single lost ship could mean months of hardship or lives lost, the ability to harness the sun's light into a signal was nothing short of miraculous. One remarkable example comes from the island of Drepana, modern-day Trapani in Sicily, where ancient civilizations first experimented with mirrors to guide ships into harbor. Centuries later, the Venetians improved these techniques, installing complex arrays of polished metal and glass to create dazzling flashes visible for miles. The lighthouse itself became a structure not only built of stone but built around light, a delicate dance between architecture and optics. In Northern Europe, too, keepers of the light refined these methods. On the coasts of Norway, Sweden, and Scotland, mirrors sometimes caught fleeting sunlight to warn against treacherous cliffs hidden beneath fog or mist. The play of light and shadow took on almost mystical qualities, a golden shimmer that seemed to dance on the waves themselves. Local fishermen spoke of the sun's eye watching over them, a quiet guardian glowing in daylight when fire was useless. Yet these heliographic lighthouses were not only practical but poetic. They required a harmony between human hands, natural elements, and the sun's steady course. The act of maintaining these beams was a ritual, carefully cleaning and polishing mirrors, tracking the sun's daily journey, adjusting angles with precision, and knowing when to watch the horizon for returning sails. It was patience shaped into light, a labor that connected the keeper to the very movements of the heavens. With the rise of glassmaking in the Renaissance, mirror technology advanced further. The invention of the parabolic mirror allowed light to be concentrated into stronger, more focused beams. This breakthrough enabled lighthouses to send signals farther than ever before, though it also meant that heliographic methods had to evolve or make way for flame-based lenses that could shine through the night. Still, during daylight, the mirror's reflection remained a powerful tool, especially when paired with flags or shutters to modulate flashes. Across the centuries, these golden beams linked communities and sailors across vast distances. A silent conversation spoken in flashes of light. The concept of signaling by reflected sunlight also inspired early forms of communication, from military heliographs flashing Morse code across deserts and mountains, to explorers transmitting messages across islands. These were descendants of those early lighthouse mirrors, a language made of light. In many ways, the story of these luminous lighthouses is the story of humans learning to harness nature's subtle forces, reflecting light to guide others, transforming the sun's daily arc into a steady, life-saving pulse. It is a reminder that even before modern technology, careful observation and patience could turn simple tools into extraordinary instruments of safety. Tonight, as you imagine the sun's rays slicing across a calm sea, catching on polished glass and metal, think of those lighthouse keepers, steady, watchful, adjusting their mirrors in rhythm with the sky. Their quiet labor, blending science and art, was a beacon not just for ships, but for all who depend on light to find their way home. Our story continues as we move into the 18th and 19th centuries, when the art of harnessing sunlight in lighthouses grew alongside advances in science and technology, transforming the very way ships navigated the seas. The world was awakening to the power of optics, and lighthouse keepers became custodians of both tradition and innovation, their craft balancing between ancient wisdom and modern precision. During this period, the quest to perfect the daylight signal drove experimentation with new materials and mechanisms. Mirrors were crafted from polished metals like silver and copper, often backed with tin or mercury to enhance reflectivity. Glass became more common, with artisans perfecting techniques to create smooth, curved surfaces that could bend light more efficiently. The invention of the parabolic mirror was pivotal. Its shape allowed parallel rays of sunlight to be focused into a narrow, intense beam, reaching farther across turbulent waters. Keepers of these heliographic lighthouses had to master both science and the unpredictable moods of nature. The sun's position changed with the seasons and latitudes, requiring adjustments in mirror angles throughout the day and year. Early on, this was done manually, with keepers using calibrated scales or simple trial and error to catch the light just so. In some places, clockwork mechanisms were introduced to rotate mirrors slowly and keep the beam aligned with the sun's arc, a marriage of engineering and celestial observation. One fascinating site of such innovation was the lighthouse at Cape St. Vincent, on Portugal's southwestern tip, where rugged cliffs meet the Atlantic. Here, heliographs were used not just as navigational aids but as communication tools. Signals relayed by flashes of reflected sunlight conveyed warnings of storms or shipwrecks, coordinating coastal defense and maritime traffic. This network of light was an early form of optical telegraphy, a language made possible by the understanding of angles, timing, and light's behavior. While these developments flourished along the Atlantic and Mediterranean, other regions saw unique adaptations. In the cold, often overcast waters of northern Europe, lighthouse keepers devised systems to enhance the limited sunlight available. Silvered glass lenses paired with mirrors multiplied beams, and shutters modulated light to create coded signals. These coded flashes became an early form of identification, telling ships not only where land was but which harbor lay ahead. The importance of heliographic light in maritime safety cannot be overstated. For centuries, shipwrecks and lost crews were all too common, and the difference between a safe harbor and rocky shoals was often a matter of minutes and visibility. Before radio waves carried voices across the waves, light was the clearest message that could be sent in daylight. A flash from a distant lighthouse might save lives, guide trade routes, or prevent disaster during fog or mist. These early lighthouse mirrors also inspired practical communication on land. In the Napoleonic Wars, for example, armies used heliographs, mirror-based signaling devices, to send coded messages across battlefields and between fortifications. The principles were the same. A sunbeam directed precisely, interrupted or modulated to create patterns, decipherable by trained observers miles away. The effectiveness of this system demonstrated how light could become a carrier of not only direction but information, linking human eyes and minds over great distances. Returning to the lighthouses themselves, the daily routines of keepers were a blend of science, ritual, and care. Polishing mirrors to remove salt spray and dust was a constant task, as any imperfection could scatter the light and weaken the beam. Tracking the sun's movement required patience and a keen sense of timing, with some keepers using handcrafted instruments to mark the sun's position throughout the day. When the sky clouded over, keepers might wait, hopeful for a clearing, knowing that each flash of light could mean safety for ships yet unseen. This intimate relationship with light and nature gave heliographic lighthouses a certain poetry, even as their practical value was immense. The sun's beams became more than illumination. They were a rhythm of life on the coast, a daily performance between earth and sky. And while the glow of lamps and lenses would eventually eclipse heliographs in the night, daylight mirrors held their place for many years, a testament to the clever ways humans have always found to coax guidance from the elements. As you imagine this, picture a polished mirror gleaming in the sun, its beam cutting a golden path over rippling waves. The faint shimmer reaches a distant sail, and somewhere, a watchful sailor sees the light and steadies course, knowing that the shoreline is near and safety within reach. It is a quiet miracle, born of angles, patience, and a deep understanding of the world's natural rhythms. Our story tonight draws toward its close as we consider the twilight of heliographic lighthouses and the legacy they have left on maritime navigation and human ingenuity. With the dawn of the 19th century, advancements in technology began to reshape how light was used to guide ships. But the golden beams reflected from mirrors remain an enduring symbol of human creativity in harmony with nature. The introduction of the Fresnel lens in the 1820s revolutionized lighthouse illumination. This ingenious design used concentric rings of glass to capture and bend light from a relatively small lamp into a powerful, focused beam, visible for miles both day and night. While Fresnel lenses were most effective with flame-based light sources, their arrival marked a gradual shift away from heliographic systems. Yet, even as oil lamps and eventually electric bulbs took over, the principles of light reflection and precise angles remained fundamental to lighthouse operation. Despite technological shifts, many coastal communities cherished their old heliographic lighthouses for years. They were a testament to endurance, the patience of lighthouse keepers who had spent days aligning mirrors, polishing surfaces, and watching skies for a chance to cast a guiding glow. The image of light bending across water, traveling unseen pathways, is one that continues to capture imaginations. In places where fog and weather limited visibility, keepers combined mirror flashes with smoke signals or flags, blending ancient and new methods into a layered system of communication. In today's world of GPS and radio beacons, it might seem that the age of reflected sunlight is long past. Yet, the heliograph's legacy lives on in unexpected ways. Solar communication devices, light-based signaling in remote locations, and even modern fiber optics owe much to the understanding of light's behavior that those early lighthouse experiments fostered. The patient art of capturing sunlight and shaping it into a message remains a foundational chapter in the story of human connection across distances. As you settle deeper into rest, imagine once more the sunlit beam flashing across a calm sea, the quiet watch of a lighthouse keeper adjusting a mirror as the waves sigh softly beneath. This light, born from angles and polished patience, guided countless souls home when all else seemed dark or uncertain. It is a reminder that sometimes the simplest tools, tuned carefully to the rhythms of nature, can be the most profound. May the story, whispered through soft winds and distant waters, carry you gently toward dreams where light and shadow dance together, and where every journey, no matter how far, finds its way by the steady promise of a golden beam. Welcome, Voyager. Tonight, we sail toward a place that once stood in the sunlight, glittering white under the Persian Gulf sky, and vanished as if it had been nothing more than a mirage. An island made not of rock, not of sand, but of salt. It is said that during a storm, the waves climbed over it, the rain poured down, and the whole place dissolved back into the water. A strange fate for a piece of land. But perhaps that is the danger of building your home from something that melts. You could say it was the only island in the world that feared soup season. Before we set sail, if you enjoy drifting through these quiet voyages into the geography of memory, don't forget to like and subscribe, and drop a coordinate in the comments so we know where you're listening from. If your home holds its own story of a place lost to tide, time, or storm, it may well be mapped into a future voyage. So let the sea air soften your thoughts. Feel the gentle press of warm wind against your skin, the hush of water beneath the keel, the scent of brine just sharp enough to remind you where we are. Our story tonight begins in the Persian Gulf, a body of water shaped like a shallow crescent between the Arabian Peninsula and the southern coast of Iran. For millennia, it has been a place of trade, conflict, and legend. Across its turquoise shallows and deeper channels, dhows once sailed laden with dates, pearls, and spices, and the shorelines were dotted with fishing villages and salt pans. It was here, somewhere along these shifting coasts, that the tale of the Salt Island was born. Salt islands do exist, though they are rare. In some cases, they form where thick beds of underground salt are pushed up by geological forces until they breach the surface. Over time, the action of wind and water can erode away the surrounding rock, leaving the salt dome exposed. In arid climates, such as the Gulf region, these salt structures can survive for centuries, provided they are not heavily eroded by rainfall or waves. In the Persian Gulf, salt domes and islands are tied to the region's unique geology. Beneath much of Iran and parts of the Gulf lies a thick layer of ancient evaporites, sediments deposited when shallow seas evaporated millions of years ago. These layers, trapped beneath heavier rock, can slowly flow upward under pressure, creating dome-shaped intrusions. When they reach the surface, they form features known locally as Kui Namak, or mountains of salt. Some of these are inland, shimmering white under the desert sun. Others rise from the sea itself, One of the most famous surviving examples is Abu Musa Island's salt dome in the southern Gulf, though it is mostly capped with soil and vegetation. More striking are the salt domes of Keshem Island and Hormuz Island, where rainbow-colored minerals streak across the surface. Hormuz, in particular, is often called the Rainbow Island for its brilliant layers of red, yellow, white, and purple earth. Beneath it all lies salt, pushing slowly upward. But a salt island is not an immortal thing. Rain, rare though it may be in the Gulf, can carve channels through salt at surprising speed. A single heavy storm can dissolve surfaces and undercut cliffs. The same process can occur at sea, where waves crash and spray wears away the base of the dome. If the salt formation is small, it may collapse entirely, vanishing below the tide line. The story told by sailors in the region speaks of such a collapse. They describe an island no more than a few hundred meters across, bright white under the sun, surrounded by waters so shallow they could be waded. Fishermen would stop there to scrape salt for preserving their catch, filling baskets with crystalline chunks that could be traded in the markets of Bandar Abbas or Sharjah. The island had no vegetation, no fresh water, and no shelter from the sun. It was a place of passing utility, nothing more. Then came the storm. Accounts vary. Some say it was a rare cyclone that swept in from the Arabian Sea, driving rain and wind in sheets that lasted for days. Others claim it was a single night of violent squalls. In both tellings, the rain poured so heavily that the island's surface began to soften and slump. The waves, whipped higher by the wind, undercut its edges. By the time the storm passed, the fishermen who returned could no longer find the place. The sea covered it entirely, as though it had never been. Legends of disappearing islands are not unique to the Persian Gulf. In the Indian Ocean, sailors have told of sandbanks swallowed overnight, of volcanic caves collapsing into their own craters, of coral atolls scoured to nothing by cyclones. But salt is especially vulnerable. Even in the world's driest deserts, salt formations bear the marks of meltwater from the occasional rainstorm. In the Sala de Uyuni of Bolivia, the world's largest salt flat, seasonal flooding turns the landscape into a shallow mirror. In Iran's Dashti cavern, the salt crust hides treacherous mud beneath, and the edges dissolve into small briny lagoons after storms. Historically, salt has been so important to human life, for preserving food, for trade, for rituals, that its geography is often well documented. Ancient caravan routes in Arabia and Persia followed the locations of salt mines and pans. Cities rose near salt springs. Ports exported the mineral alongside dates and textiles. In the Gulf, coastal salt pans were once worked by hand, the crystals raked into piles under the sun. An island of solid salt in the sea would have been a convenient bonus, a ready source without the need for drying beds. Some historians suspect the vanished salt island may have been part of a chain of such formations along the Gulf's eastern shore, many of which have eroded over the centuries. Without detailed charts from the period, and with coastal geography shifting due to sediment deposits from rivers like the Shat al-Arab, pinpointing the exact location is difficult. It may have been close to the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, or further west near the shallows of the UAE coast. Modern satellite imagery occasionally reveals pale shapes beneath the shallow Gulf waters, hints of former islands or sandbanks now submerged. In some cases, these are remnants of tidal features. In others, they may indeed be the eroded tops of salt domes. Whether any of these match the fisherman's island is uncertain. In 2010, a marine geologist studying seabed formations near the Iranian coast noted several submerged salt structures that could, under the right conditions, have once broken the surface. His research suggested that smaller domes, when exposed, can disappear within decades if wave and rain erosion coincide. Such a fate would align neatly with the oral histories of the Gulf Salt Island, a reminder of how quickly the sea can erase its own landmarks. The disappearance of a landform, even a small one, can leave a quiet but lingering mark on those who depended on it. For the fishermen and traders of the Persian Gulf, the Salt Islands' loss meant more than just the absence of a convenient resource. It disrupted patterns that had been repeated for generations. Stopping at the island was a rhythm in their voyages, a midpoint to rest or to fill their sacks with salt. Without it, journeys stretched longer, supplies had to be carried from shore, and the sea itself felt subtly altered. In coastal communities, geography is more than backdrop. It is a living partner in daily life. In the villages along the Iranian coast, from Bandar Lenja to Jask, elders would speak of the island in the same way one might speak of a relative who had passed away. The loss was mourned, even if in practical terms it was survivable. And because the Gulf is a place where oral tradition runs deep, the story persisted, passed between sailors as a kind of cautionary tale about the fragility of the sea's gifts. We know from geological studies that the Persian Gulf's shoreline and seafloor have never been static. Sediment from the Tigris, Euphrates, and Karun rivers flows in at a steady rate, reshaping deltas and pushing coastlines outward in some places while eroding them in others. Shallow banks that once formed natural harbors can vanish over decades, and islands can emerge or sink with surprising speed. For salt domes, this constant movement of water and sand can expose them one year and bury them the next. In the modern age, we often think of islands as fixed coordinates, neatly charted on maps and protected by maritime law. But before the precision of GPS and hydrographic surveys, many smaller islands existed only in the memory of those who saw them. A fisherman might know a reef by the way the water changed color above it, or an islet by the shape of the birds that nested there. If the feature vanished, it was as though a page in the atlas had simply gone blank. The vanished salt island also fits into a broader pattern of ephemeral islands throughout history. One example can be found far to the west, in the Arabian Sea, where in 1839 sailors reported a new island rising near Gwadar after an earthquake. This was a mud volcano, a conical mound that erupted gas and mud from the seafloor. For a few months, it stood above the waterline, solid enough for curious visitors to land. But within a year, wave action had worn it away, and it sank back beneath the sea. Several such islands have appeared and vanished along the Makran coast in the past 2 centuries. The difference with the Gulf Salt Island is that it likely stood for decades, even centuries, before disappearing. Its erosion was not the sudden collapse of an unstable mound, but the slow, inevitable work of weather, made swift only by the rare convergence of heavy rain and rough seas. This is perhaps why the story endures. It was not simply an island that came and went, but one that people had lived alongside, used, and trusted. Salt itself has a curious place in the history of the Gulf. Long before oil became the region's most famous export, salt was a valued commodity. Archaeological evidence from as far back as 6000 BCE shows that coastal settlements along the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula engaged in salt collection. In some cases, salt was traded inland to areas where natural deposits were scarce. Its use in preserving fish and meat was vital for survival in the harsh climate. To lose a natural salt source was not just an inconvenience, but a small economic blow. On Hormuz Island, just over 100 kilometers from the likely site of the vanished Salt Island, the link between salt and history is still visible. Hormuz's salt domes not only create vivid landscapes but also supply local artisans who use the mineral in dyes, paints, and decorative crafts. The island's old fort, built by the Portuguese in the early 16th century, stands near the shoreline where ships once loaded salt and minerals for export. It is not hard to imagine the vanished island's salt being gathered in much the same way, stacked in woven baskets aboard wooden dhows. In more recent times, Marine scientists have taken an interest in the Gulf's salt domes for reasons beyond navigation or trade. These formations can influence local ecosystems, creating unique habitats for marine life. Small fish and crustaceans shelter in crevices at the base of the domes, and certain algae thrive in the briny seepage where salt meets seawater. The disappearance of even a small island could subtly shift the balance of such microhabitats, altering feeding grounds for birds and affecting the distribution of marine species. While the vanished salt island has no confirmed coordinates, some speculative reconstructions place it near the shallow sandbanks off Sir Abu Nuair, an island belonging to the United Arab Emirates. These shallows are known for their shifting shapes, and divers have reported unusual white crusts on the seafloor in places, remnants, perhaps, of ancient salt exposure. Another possibility lies further east, near the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz, where the seabed geology is more favorable for salt dome formation. Without a targeted geological survey, the truth remains hidden beneath the waves. Stories like this often blur the line between memory and myth. In telling and retelling, details shift, timelines stretch, and certainty fades. But the core truth, that the sea can unmake as easily as it makes, remains. The Gulf's fishermen understood this in a way few outsiders could. They had seen channels open where sandbanks once lay, and mangroves drown in sudden shifts of tide. They knew that even the hardest stone could be worn to nothing, and that salt, for all its usefulness, was among the most vulnerable of all. The island's fate also speaks to a broader truth about the Persian Gulf's environment. It is a place of delicate balances. Freshwater inflow from rivers mixes with high evaporation rates under intense heat, creating salinity levels higher than most other seas. The organisms that live here are adapted to these conditions, but the balance can be tipped by storms, temperature shifts, or human activity. An exposed salt dome, already on the edge of dissolution, would have been especially at risk in such a setting. In a way, the island's disappearance has given it a kind of permanence it never had in life. As long as it stood above the water, it was just a stopover, a useful lump of mineral in a busy sea. Now that it is gone, it has become a point of fascination, a story to pass on during long nights aboard ship, a reminder that even the sea's landmarks can melt away. From time to time, rumors surface of fishermen spotting a pale shape under the water in the old sailing routes. Some claim to have anchored above it and pulled up pieces of crystalline salt from the seabed. Others say the sea has long since swallowed every trace. In either case, the vanished salt island exists now less as a location than as a story, and in the Gulf, stories are often the most enduring maps of all. Our story now turns to the years after the storm, when the maps of the Gulf began to quietly change. In the records of European trading companies, small adjustments in charts show the absence of a once noted island. Early Portuguese navigators had marked it as a caution, warning that ships could run aground on its low rise if they passed too close in certain tides. By the 18th century, British and Dutch maps no longer carried its name, the blank space suggesting open water where a landmark had been. To those unfamiliar with its history, the erasure might have seemed an improvement, one less obstacle in a busy maritime route. But for those who had known it, the absence was a reminder of fragility, of how the sea could take back even what had seemed immovable. Oral tradition preserved what ink had abandoned. In the fishing towns of the Iranian coast, older men told younger ones about the time rain had made the sea taste different for days. Women recalled the color of the sky before the storm, a greenish light that had made the horizon seem closer. Children, hearing the stories, sometimes went down to the water's edge after rain, hoping to see floating salt as a sign of the vanished island. In Bahrain, a few navigators spoke of a sudden clarity in the Gulf's channels in the seasons after the loss, as if the island's dissolution had changed currents in ways too subtle for science at the time to record, but keenly felt by those who read the sea through long habit. Modern oceanographers, studying satellite imagery and salinity levels, have considered whether the event described could have been the end of a natural salt dome, exposed above water for centuries before breaking apart. The Persian Gulf is shallow in many areas, with depths averaging only about 35 meters, and its seafloor holds numerous salt diapirs, where ancient deposits push upward through overlying rock. Some remain buried, others rise into small islands. The composition of such structures means that under the right conditions, they can dissolve with surprising speed, especially if fractured by tectonic movement or heavy wave action. A rare but intense storm could do what decades of gentle erosion could not, collapsing and scattering a salt mass beyond recognition. If this is what happened, the island's disappearance would have been less a singular act than the final moment of a long, hidden process. In that sense, the storm was not the destroyer but the last chapter in a slow unwriting. This idea finds a kind of echo in the way history remembers certain places, holding on to them in story long after their physical presence is gone. The Gulf itself holds many such absences. Ancient harbors now sit beneath sediment. Trade routes that once carried spices and pearls have shifted, replaced by new priorities. Each change leaves a trace that is both visible and invisible, recorded in some way yet missing in others. Among those who have studied maritime history of the region, the Salt Island story is often cited alongside that of other ephemeral landforms. In the Gulf of California, tidal changes have erased entire sandbars within a few years. In the North Sea, islands documented in medieval times have been swallowed by shifting channels. These examples underline how maps, though made to convey stability, are often only momentary reflections. The Salt Island, in its brief appearance on certain charts, was one such reflection, a point fixed in ink but never in the deeper ledger of the Earth's shape. By the late 19th century, the island had entered a different kind of record. In the reports of the British Admiralty, a note appeared describing a location once thought to hold a small salt island, now considered doubtful. Such phrasing, common in hydrographic surveys, signaled the quiet retirement of a place from navigational awareness. Yet this removal from official use only sharpened its presence in local memory. A thing no longer on the map gains a quality of secrecy, belonging more fully to those who keep its story alive. In this way, the island joined the catalog of places known primarily through recollection, a geography of the mind as much as of the sea. In the present day, few would be able to point to the exact coordinates where it stood. The Gulf surface offers no obvious clue, just the same mix of deep blue and pale green where shallows meet channels. Yet divers and researchers who have gone looking for geological evidence sometimes speak of a particular undersea ridge, its crest whitened by residual salt, lying some meters below the waves. Whether this is the remnant of the island or simply another salt structure is hard to prove, but it serves as a point for imagination to anchor. It is here, some believe, that the rain once met the sea in such quantity that an island faded in the space of a storm. The island's legacy, if such a word can be used for something so impermanent, lies partly in what it suggests about the relationship between land and sea in the Gulf. Here, boundaries are often less fixed than elsewhere. Tidal flats can stretch kilometers, blurring the line between shore and water. Shifting sandbanks can turn a deep channel into a hazard in a single season. The Salt Island's vanishing fits into this pattern, a reminder that what appears certain on one voyage may not be so on the next. For mariners of the past, this uncertainty was both a challenge and a measure of skill, demanding close attention not just to maps but to the changing language of the sea itself. In telling the story now, one also tells of the Gulf's broader history, where trade, culture, and environment have long been in constant exchange. Pearling fleets once sailed routes that passed near the island, their wooden dhows carrying the labor of divers and the hopes of merchants. Fishing communities timed their movements with the seasons, reading the water's color and the sky's tone. The island was one point in a network of knowledge, its presence part of how people oriented themselves in the vastness of the Gulf. Its absence forced a recalibration, subtle but real. Such adjustments, multiplied over centuries, shape the living memory of a place as much as any enduring landmark. When rain falls over the Gulf today, it is often brief, scattered, and quickly absorbed into the heat of the air. Yet every so often, a heavier storm passes, darkening the water and blurring the horizon. In those moments, the thought of the salt island returns, unbidden, to those who have heard of it. The mind makes a picture. Low white mounds gleaming against a steel sky, then softening, shrinking, and finally gone. It is not a loss in the ordinary sense, for the island's story has endured, traveling in voices and in the quiet footnotes of history. As you drift toward rest, you might imagine the sound of that rain on the open water, steady and close. Beneath it, the hiss of salt dissolving, a sound too small to be heard from the deck of a ship, yet enough to mark the end of a place. The sea smooths itself over the change, the sky clears, and the Gulf returns to its usual calm. Only the story remains, and tonight it is yours to keep, carried on the tide of memory into sleep.